The late September afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with the golden warmth that makes English villages look like illustrations from a children's storybook. The annual Harvest Festival fete spread across the village green in its customary splendor, with bunting strung between the elm trees and trestle tables groaning under the weight of jam pots, seed cakes, and the inevitable array of knitted goods that appeared at every village gathering. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly behind the white elephant stall, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a delicate baby shawl, her pale blue eyes taking in the familiar tableau of village life with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that the most ordinary moments often concealed the most extraordinary secrets. The afternoon's highlight was to be the presentation of prizes by Mrs. Cynthia Harrington, the village's newest and most prominent resident. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead 6 months earlier, purchasing the old manor house and immediately establishing herself as a woman of strong opinions and considerable influence. Her wealth was evident in everything from her perfectly tailored clothes to her generous donations to the church roof fund, but there was something about her manner that suggested she was accustomed to having her way in all matters, large and small. Mrs. Harrington had been expected at 3 o'clock to judge the flower arrangements and present the silver cup that bore her own name, having donated it with characteristic flourish. But 3 o'clock had come and gone, then past, and still no sign of the lady herself. Miss Marple noticed the subtle signs of growing unease among the committee members. Mrs. Price Ridley kept glancing toward the manor house drive, while the vicar maintained his pleasant smile with increasing effort. Colonel Melchett, never one for unpunctuality, had consulted his pocket watch 3 times in as many minutes. It was young Timothy Fletcher, the postmaster's son, who came running across the green with his face flushed and his usually neat hair dishevelled. He made straight for Dr. Haydock, who was sampling Mrs. Bantry's famous lemon-curd tarts with professional thoroughness. Miss Marple observed the brief, urgent conversation that followed, noting how Dr. Haydock's expression changed from mild curiosity to sharp concern. She watched him set down his plate with careful deliberation and followed Timothy toward the path that led to the manor house, his medical bag already in his hand. The news, when it came, spread through the fete with the peculiar mixture of shock and fascination that accompanies any disruption of village routine. Mrs. Harrington had been found in her study, seated at her writing desk as if she had simply fallen asleep while attending to correspondence. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggested heart failure, sudden and apparently peaceful. She had been discovered by her housekeeper, Mrs. Jameson, who had become concerned when her mistress failed to appear for the fete despite her obvious excitement about the event. What made the discovery particularly poignant was the letter found on the desk before her, sealed but unaddressed, with what appeared to be tear stains on the expensive cream-colored paper. The wax seal bore the impression of Mrs. Harrington's personal signet ring, but the wax itself showed the telltale puckering that occurs when tears fall upon it before it has properly set. Miss Marple, who had observed such details in her long experience of human nature, found herself wondering what could have moved the usually composed Mrs. Harrington to weep over a letter she would never send. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his manner brisk and businesslike as always. He examined the scene with the thoroughness of a man who preferred clear-cut cases, and Mrs. Harrington's death appeared to offer exactly that. An elderly woman with a weak heart, overcome by emotion while writing what was clearly a personal letter, had simply succumbed to the strain. The inspector saw no reason to complicate matters with unnecessary investigation. But Miss Marple, helping Mrs. Bantry pack away the remaining cakes as the fete came to its subdued conclusion, found herself thinking about the curious timing of it all. Mrs. Harrington had been in excellent spirits that morning, according to several witnesses. She had spoken enthusiastically about the afternoon's events and had even mentioned plans for expanding the flower show next year. It seemed odd that such a woman would suddenly be moved to tears sufficient to stain a letter, particularly on a day she had been anticipating with such pleasure. There was also the matter of the letter itself. Mrs. Harrington was known for her decisive nature and clear communication. She was not the sort of woman to leave important correspondence unfinished or unaddressed. Yet here was a letter, carefully sealed but bearing no direction, suggesting either great haste or great distress in its composition. As the villagers began to disperse, carrying with them the subdued excitement that always follows unexpected drama, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to walk home through the lengthening shadows. She had learned long ago that in a place like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the most interesting secrets were often hidden in plain sight. Mrs. Harrington's sudden death might indeed be nothing more than a tragic coincidence, but Miss Marple had observed enough of human nature to know that when tears and mysteries appeared together, the truth was rarely as simple as it first appeared. The sealed letter, with its burden of unspoken words and unshed tears, seemed to beckon from the manor house study like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Miss Marple, who had never been able to resist a puzzle, particularly one involving the complex emotions of the human heart, found herself looking forward to paying a condolence call on the bereaved household. After all, it was only proper to offer comfort to Mrs. Jameson in her time of shock, and if such a visit happened to illuminate the circumstances surrounding her employer's final moments, well, that would simply be an unfortunate consequence of Christian charity. The following morning dawned with that peculiar clarity that often follows village upheavals, as if the very air had been washed clean by shock. Miss Marple took her early tea by the window, watching a robin inspect the remnants of scattered crumbs from yesterday's interrupted fete. The bird's methodical search reminded her of her own inclination to examine the small, overlooked details that others might dismiss as insignificant. She had slept fitfully, her mind returning repeatedly to the image of Mrs. Harrington's tear-stained letter and the curious timing of such overwhelming emotion. By 9 o'clock, she had donned her sensible walking shoes and prepared a small basket containing one of her prize seed cakes and a jar of gooseberry preserve. Such offerings were the accepted currency of condolence in St. Mary Mead, and experience had taught her that a well-timed visit with practical gifts often opened doors that formal inquiries could not breach. Her path to the manor house took her past the post office, where she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, emerging with her usual air of having discovered something significant. "Oh, Miss Marple," she called, adjusting her hat with the satisfaction of one bearing important news. "Such dreadful business about poor Mrs. Harrington. Though I must say, Timothy Fletcher mentioned seeing her in quite animated conversation with a young man by the churchyard Thursday evening. Rather heated, he thought, though of course one shouldn't speculate." Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathy, while noting that Mrs. Price Ridley's prohibition against speculation had never prevented her from engaging in it herself. "How distressing for young Timothy to witness such a scene," she observed mildly. "Indeed. And now this business with the sealed letter. Most peculiar, don't you think? Mrs. Harrington was always so decisive about her correspondence, never one to leave matters unfinished." The manor house drive crunched softly under Miss Marple's feet as she approached the imposing front door. Mrs. Jameson answered her knock with obvious relief, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled by grief and shock. She was a competent woman in her early 50s, the sort of housekeeper who took genuine pride in maintaining standards, and her distress was evident in the slight tremor of her hands as she accepted Miss Marple's offerings. "Oh, Miss Marple, how very thoughtful," Mrs. Jameson said, stepping aside to admit her visitor. "I'm afraid everything is rather at 6s and 7s today. The police finished their questions this morning, but there are arrangements to be made, and Mrs. Harrington had no family to speak of." Settled in the morning room with its tasteful furnishings and fresh flowers, Miss Marple accepted tea and gently encouraged the housekeeper to speak. "Such a shock for you, my dear, and so unexpected from what I understand. Mrs. Harrington seemed in excellent spirits yesterday morning." "Oh, she was indeed," Mrs. Jameson replied, her voice catching slightly. "She had her breakfast on the terrace as usual, quite excited about the fete. She even asked me to press her blue silk dress specially for the occasion." The housekeeper paused, setting down her cup with visible effort. "That's what makes it all so puzzling, Miss Marple. She was perfectly herself until the Morning Post arrived." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved in their familiar rhythm, a domestic sound that seemed to encourage confidence. "The Morning Post brought something troubling." "There was a letter," Mrs. Jameson said slowly. "Foreign postmark, with a distinctive blue edge to the envelope. Mrs. Harrington took it into her study immediately after breakfast, and when she emerged 20 minutes later, she seemed quite changed. Not upset exactly, but thoughtful in a way that wasn't like her at all." "Did she mention the letter's contents?" "Not directly, but she did ask me to cancel her appointment with the vicar about the Christmas bazaar. Said she needed to attend to some urgent correspondence. That struck me as odd, because Mrs. Harrington was never one to postpone committee business." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing away this information alongside her other observations. Through the morning room window, she could see into the study where Mrs. Harrington had died, and she noticed something that made her pause in her knitting. The fireplace grate contained the remnants of burned paper, and among the ashes was a distinctive bluish tinge that suggested expensive stationery. "I suppose Inspector Slack was quite thorough in his examination," she remarked casually. Mrs. Jameson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, yes," though he seemed quite satisfied that everything was straightforward. "Natural causes," he said. "No need for complications." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Though I did wonder about the wax seal on that final letter. It seemed rather thick, as if she had sealed and resealed it several times." As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, footsteps sounded on the gravel drive. And through the window she observed a tall, well-dressed man approaching the front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his arrival anticipated. Mrs. Jameson's face showed a flicker of something that might have been apprehension. "That will be Mr. Patrick Harrington," she explained quietly. "Mrs. Harrington's late husband's nephew. He telephoned this morning about the arrangements." Miss Marple gathered her knitting thoughtfully, reflecting that in her considerable experience, relatives who appeared promptly after unexpected deaths often had interests beyond mere grief. The morning had provided several intriguing threads, and she found herself looking forward to seeing how they might weave together into a pattern that would explain why a composed woman had wept over a foreign letter before sealing her final, unaddressed correspondence with such apparent difficulty. Patrick Harrington entered the morning room with a sort of polished confidence that came from years of successful business dealings, though Miss Marple noted something calculating in the way his eyes swept the room's furnishings before settling on its occupants. He was a man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in mourning attire that somehow managed to look more fashionable than sorrowful. His condolences to Mrs. Jameson were appropriately expressed, yet there was something in his manner that suggested he was already mentally cataloguing his inheritance. "Mrs. Jameson, you have my deepest sympathies," he said, removing his gloves with deliberate care. "Aunt Cynthia spoke of you fondly in her letters. I do hope you'll remain to help sort through her affairs." His glance moved almost immediately toward the study door, and Miss Marple observed how his fingers drummed briefly against his thigh, a gesture that suggested barely contained impatience. Mrs. Jameson accepted his condolences with dignity, though Miss Marple noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders at his presumptuous tone. "The inspector retained several items from the study, Mr. Harrington," she said carefully. "Including the letter your aunt was writing when she passed?" "Ah, yes. The mysterious, unaddressed letter," Patrick replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Most unlike Aunt Cynthia to leave correspondence unfinished. She was always so decisive about such matters. He paused, then added with studied casualness, "I don't suppose there was any other post yesterday morning. Foreign correspondence, perhaps. My aunt sometimes received letters from old acquaintances abroad." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved in their steady rhythm as she observed this exchange. "Mrs. Jameson mentioned a letter with a blue edge," she said mildly. "From South Africa, wasn't it? It seemed to distress your aunt considerably." Patrick's composure flickered for just a moment, and Miss Marple caught the brief tightening around his eyes. "South Africa? How curious. I wasn't aware Aunt Cynthia had any connections there." His recovery was smooth, but not quite smooth enough. Though, of course, she had such wide-ranging interests. Probably some charity appeal that touched her tender heart. Mrs. Pive, Jameson's expression suggested she found this characterization of her late employer's tender heart somewhat questionable, but she remained diplomatically silent. Miss Marple, however, had heard enough to confirm her growing suspicions about the nephew's knowledge of his aunt's affairs. Taking her leave with appropriate discretion, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where young Timothy Fletcher was sorting the morning mail with the self-important air of someone who had found himself at the center of village drama. His face brightened when he saw her, then immediately assumed a more solemn expression befitting the circumstances. "Such a terrible loss, Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I was the one who delivered that registered letter yesterday morning. Airmail from Johannesburg it was. Mrs. Jameson signed for it herself." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "How very observant of you to remember the details, Timothy. And I believe you witnessed Mrs. Harrington speaking with someone by the churchyard Thursday evening." The young man's chest swelled with pride at being consulted as a witness. "Yes, miss, a foreign gentleman, well-dressed but not from around here. Dark complexion, spoke with an accent. They seemed to be having quite a heated discussion, though I couldn't make out the words from where I was." This information added another piece to the puzzle forming in Miss Marple's mind. A foreign visitor, a letter from South Africa, and a nephew who seemed remarkably well informed about correspondence he claimed not to expect. Her afternoon contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at her garden gate with the troubled expression of a man wrestling with professional ethics. "Jane, I find myself in rather an uncomfortable position regarding Mrs. Harrington's death," he began without preamble. She invited him to sit among her late roses, noting his genuine distress. "The medical examination raised concerns. Not concerns exactly, but inconsistencies that trouble me." Dr. Haydock cleaned his spectacles with unusual care. Her heart showed signs of strain, certainly, but not the acute damage one would expect from fatal failure. And there was something else that Inspector Slack dismissed as irrelevant. She had a small puncture wound on her left hand, barely visible, but quite fresh. "Could have been a thorn," he said, "but Mrs. Harrington wasn't known for gardening." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her knitting. "Did you mention your concerns to the inspector?" "I tried, but he's convinced the case is straightforward. Natural death brought on by emotional shock. He sees no reason to complicate matters with what he calls medical trivialities." Dr. Haydock replaced his glasses and looked directly at her. "But you and I both know that in matters of sudden death, the smallest details often tell the most important stories." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself at her window, watching the lights twinkle in cottage windows while her mind worked through the day's revelations. The pattern was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. A foreign correspondent who had met Mrs. Harrington secretly, a letter from South Africa that had caused profound distress, a nephew who knew more than he admitted, and now medical evidence that suggested Mrs. Harrington's death might not have been as natural as Inspector Slack believed. The sealed letter with its tear-stained wax remained the central mystery. What had moved such a composed woman to weep over correspondence, and why had she sealed a letter without addressing it? Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay in the connection between the foreign visitor, the South African letter, and Patrick Harrington's obvious anxiety about his aunt's papers. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay another visit to Mrs. Jameson. The poor woman would surely appreciate continued support. And it was only natural that their conversation might turn to the various visitors and correspondence that had marked Mrs. Harrington's final days. After all, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, The truth had a way of emerging when people felt comfortable enough to share their observations, and Mrs. Jameson struck her as a woman who noticed far more than she was usually asked to reveal. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage door, his manner brisk and decidedly defensive as he settled into a small parlor with the air of a man determined to close a case rather than investigate one. He accepted her offer of tea with barely concealed impatience, clearly viewing this visit as a necessary courtesy to quiet village speculation rather than a professional consultation. "I understand there's been considerable talk about Mrs. Harrington's death," he began without preamble, his tone suggesting that such talk was both unwelcome and misguided. "While I appreciate the village's natural curiosity, I want to assure everyone that this is a straightforward matter. The lady died of heart failure brought on by emotional distress. Dr. Haydock's concerns about minor details are understandable but ultimately irrelevant to the cause of death." Miss Marple poured tea with her characteristic careful attention, noting how the inspector's dismissive confidence suggested he was more concerned with avoiding complications than pursuing inconvenient truth. "Of course, Inspector, though I confess myself somewhat puzzled by certain small details that seem to contradict such a simple explanation." Inspector Slack's expression tightened perceptibly. "Such as? Well, the foreign letter, for instance. Mrs. Jameson described her employer as thoughtful rather than immediately distressed after receiving it. Yet you suggest it caused fatal shock." "The letter was destroyed, burned in the fireplace before Mrs. Harrington's collapse," Slack replied with the confidence of someone who had decided upon his facts. "Only ashes remained, which is unfortunate but not uncommon when people receive upsetting news. Some prefer to eliminate the source of their distress immediately." After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple made her way once again to the manor house, this time armed with a jar of her special honey and the gentle persistence that had served her so well in previous investigations. Mrs. Jameson welcomed her with obvious relief, and they settled in the morning room where the autumn light fell softly across the polished furniture. "I do hope you won't think me presumptuous," Miss Marple began, "but I couldn't help noticing yesterday that the study seemed rather disturbed. Perhaps some fresh flowers might provide a touch of comfort in that room where poor Mrs. Harrington spent her final moments." Mrs. Jameson's gratitude at this thoughtful suggestion opened the door Miss Marple had hoped for, and soon she found herself alone in the study where so many questions remained unanswered. The grate still held its telltale traces of blue-edged ash, but more interesting was the writing desk itself. The blotting paper bore the faint impression of reversed writing, just legible enough to make out "My dear," followed by what appeared to be the beginning of an S. On the leather desktop, a small red oval showed where hot wax had been pressed, lifted, and pressed again, suggesting multiple attempts at sealing. Most intriguing of all was the brass seal in its velvet-lined box, sitting open beside a freshly nicked stick of red sealing wax. The signet ring that should have made the proper impression was nowhere to be found. Her solitary investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Endicott, Mrs. Harrington's solicitor, a grave and courteous gentleman who seemed genuinely distressed by his client's sudden death. "Such a tragedy," he murmured, observing Miss Marple's flower arrangement with approval. "Mrs. Harrington had asked me to call next week about adding a codicil to her will. Nothing elaborate," she said, "just a modest charitable addition." He paused thoughtfully. "She used the word restitution, which struck me as rather an unusual term for charitable giving." This revelation cast Mrs. Harrington's final days in an entirely new light. A woman planning restitution was a woman with something on her conscience, something significant enough to require legal documentation. Returning to Mrs. Jameson in the morning room, Miss Marple gently encouraged further confidences. "I imagine Mrs. Harrington kept her personal papers very carefully organized." "Oh, yes, though there was one drawer in her desk that remained always locked," Mrs. Jameson replied. She said it contained old letters and mementos from her younger days, things too personal to share. Mr. Patrick has been quite insistent about opening it, even sending for a locksmith from town." "How very thorough of him," Miss Marple observed mildly. "And the gentleman who visited Thursday evening, the one young Timothy saw by the churchyard?" Mrs. Jameson's expression grew troubled. "Mr. Van Heerden. He arrived quite unexpectedly and seemed to distress Mrs. Harrington considerably. She insisted he stay the night, but their conversation that evening was rather heated. I couldn't help overhearing some of it from the hall. He mentioned something about making things right and what was owed, while she kept saying she had done more than enough already. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Colonel Melchett, who appeared at Miss Marple's cottage with the troubled expression of a man wrestling with official discretion and personal unease. "The thing is, Jane," he said, accepting her offer of sherry, "I've made some discreet inquiries about Mrs. Harrington's background. It seems she left South Africa rather suddenly 6 months ago, following some sort of scandal involving her late husband's business dealings. Nothing criminal, you understand, but sufficient to make her position there untenable." This information provided crucial context for the mysterious correspondence and foreign visitor. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And Mr. Patrick Harrington?" "That's what troubles me most," Colonel Melchett continued. "He was in South Africa himself until quite recently, supposedly involved in mining interests. His return to England coincided remarkably well with his aunt's departure from Johannesburg." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her mind worked through the day's revelations. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new thread of information. A woman fleeing scandal in South Africa, a nephew with suspiciously convenient timing, a foreign visitor making demands about old debts, and a planned codicil involving restitution. The missing signet ring and repeatedly sealed letter suggested someone had been very careful about the final message Mrs. Harrington had tried to send. Dr. Haydock's observation about the small puncture wound took on new significance when considered alongside Inspector Slack's determination to avoid complications. Miss Marple had observed enough of human nature to recognize that when convenient explanations were offered for inconvenient facts, the truth was usually far more complex than anyone wished to admit. The sealed letter with its tear-stained wax remained the central puzzle, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that those tears might not have been tears of grief or shock, but rather of fear or guilt. Tomorrow, she decided, she would need to have a very careful conversation with Mr. Van Heerden, whose continued presence at the Blue Boar suggested he was still waiting for something that Mrs. Harrington's death had left unresolved. The morning mist still clung to the village green when Miss Marple made her way to the Blue Boar, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones. She had spent a restless night considering Dr. Sumpter Haydock's concerns and the curious coincidences surrounding Mrs. Harrington's death, and she felt certain that Mr. Van Heerden held pieces of the puzzle that had yet to be properly examined. She found him in the residence lounge, a man whose weathered dignity spoke of someone who had endured considerable hardship without losing his fundamental decency. His dark eyes held the patient wariness of someone who had traveled far to seek justice that might never come, and when Miss Marple introduced herself as a neighbor of the late Mrs. Harrington, his expression became carefully guarded. "A tragic loss," he said, rising with old-world courtesy. Mrs. Harrington was a woman of conscience, though she carried burdens that were perhaps too heavy for one person to bear alone. Miss Marple settled into the chintz armchair opposite him, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for an extended conversation. Such old friendships across such distances are precious. You must have known her for many years. "Not friendship exactly," Van Heerden replied carefully, his accent lending gravity to his words. "Business brought me here, Miss Marple. Unfinished business from South Africa that her husband's death left unresolved." He paused, studying her gentle expression with the caution of someone who had learned that appearances could deceive. "I was a partner in Robert Harrington's mining venture. When the company collapsed, many people lost everything they had worked for across generations. The bitterness beneath his controlled tone was unmistakable, and Miss Marple's needles moved in their steady rhythm as she absorbed this confirmation of her suspicions. How very distressing, and Mrs. Harrington felt some responsibility for these losses. She knew more than she admitted, Van Heerden said quietly, about the falsified reports, the diverted funds, the deliberate deception of investors. When I met with her Thursday evening, she was finally beginning to understand that moral debts do not die with the debtor. His voice dropped further. She had promised to make restitution, but her nephew had been working to convince her that such payments would be foolish sentiment. This revelation cast Patrick Harrington's anxious behavior in an entirely new light. His concern about his aunt's correspondence and his eagerness to access her private papers suddenly seemed far more calculated than grief-stricken. "The letter from Johannesburg that arrived yesterday morning," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. "Would that have contained additional pressure regarding these obligations?" Van Heerden nodded grimly. Documentation that would have made her legal position quite difficult to defend. When I left her Thursday evening, she was deeply distressed but determined to find a way to do what was right, even if it meant defying her nephew's wishes. Miss Marple thanked him for his candor and made her way to the manor house, where she found considerable activity and progress. A locksmith had been summoned, and Patrick Harrington stood beside Mrs. Harrington's writing desk with barely concealed impatience, while Mr. Endicott observed the proceedings with professional gravity. "We thought it best to examine Aunt Cynthia's private papers without delay," Patrick explained, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Settling her affairs promptly is only decent." The locksmith's tools clicked against the brass mechanism, and soon the narrow drawer slid open to reveal neat stacks of correspondence, a faded photograph, and a small velvet case. Patrick's hand moved immediately to the case, opening it with theatrical surprise. "Empty," he announced. "Aunt Cynthia's signet ring is missing. She never parted with it." Mr. Endicott began examining the letters with methodical care, while Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause in arranging fresh flowers. The drawer seemed unusually shallow, and Mrs. Jameson, hovering diplomatically in the doorway, murmured something about false bottoms being common in old furniture. The locksmith obliged with a thin blade, and with careful pressure the panel lifted, releasing the dry scent of hidden papers. Beneath lay a single envelope of cream-colored paper, sealed with an uneven blob of red wax that showed the telltale puckering of tears dried too quickly. There was no address, only the faintest trace of graphite at one corner that might have been the beginning of an S. Mr. Endicott lifted it with the reverence due to what was clearly Mrs. Harrington's final, most important correspondence. "This should go to Inspector Slack immediately," he said firmly. Miss Marple observed Patrick's barely concealed frustration and Mrs. Jameson's whitened knuckles as the housekeeper gripped the doorframe. The sealed letter represented Mrs. Harrington's last attempt to ensure justice would be done, but someone had clearly hoped it would never be found. The missing signet ring suggested that the proper authentication of this crucial document had been deliberately prevented, leaving its contents vulnerable to challenge or dismissal. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the study, Miss Marple reflected that the pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation, though the most dangerous threads remained carefully hidden beneath the surface of village respectability. Inspector Slack arrived at the manor house with the reluctant air of a man whose tidy conclusions were being systematically dismantled by inconvenient evidence. He examined the sealed envelope with visible displeasure, turning it over in his hands as if hoping the troublesome document might somehow vanish through official disapproval. Mr. Endicott stood by with professional gravity, while Patrick Harrington maintained his pose of concerned nephew, though Miss Marple noticed how his fingers drummed against his thigh with increasing frequency. "Breaking a private seal requires proper justification," Slack announced finally. though given the circumstances of discovery, I suppose we must examine the contents." He paused, studying the thick, uneven wax with its telltale tear stains. Most irregular sealing appears to have been done several times over. Patrick stepped forward with calculated concern. Aunt Cynthia sometimes sealed letters she never intended to send, particularly when distressed about business matters. She found the ritual soothing, rather like some people find comfort in prayer. His explanation sounded rehearsed, and Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Jameson's expression tightened at this characterization of her late employer's habits. Using a thin blade, Mr. Endicott carefully lifted the wax seal, revealing cream-colored paper covered in Mrs. Harrington's distinctive handwriting. The salutation read, "My dear Ace," and the text began with formal precision before deteriorating into increasingly unsteady strokes. Inspector Slack read aloud the opening lines, which spoke of conscience, delayed justice, and the need to make restitution for past wrongs. The letter referenced specific bank arrangements and legal preparations, but crucially, it mentioned an enclosure that was conspicuously absent from the envelope. "There should be a bank authorization," Mr. Endicott observed, examining the empty envelope thoroughly. "The letter specifically mentions the enclosed chit for the deposit box under the name Mrs. Dale. Without it, the instructions are incomplete." Patrick's relief at this missing element was almost palpable, though he concealed it behind appropriate bewilderment. "Mrs. Dale. I've never heard Aunt Cynthia mention anyone by that name. Perhaps she was more confused in her final hours than we realized." Dr. Haydock's arrival interrupted this speculation with news that transformed the entire investigation. "I've completed additional tests on the tissue samples," he announced without preamble, his grave expression indicating serious findings. "There are definite traces of a digitalis compound in Mrs. Harrington's system, not enough to cause immediate death, but certainly sufficient to induce cardiac irregularity, disorientation, and muscular weakness." The silence that followed was profound. Inspector Slack's face cycled through expressions of annoyance, concern, and grim acceptance. "You're suggesting deliberate poisoning. The concentration and type suggest a concentrated extract, administered in a small, precise dose. Combined with the puncture wound I noted on her left hand, I believe we're looking at injection by hypodermic needle." Patrick's carefully maintained composure showed its first real crack, a flush creeping up his neck as the implications settled. "Surely you're not suggesting murder. My aunt had access to numerous garden plants that might cause such effects. Foxglove grows wild throughout the county." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she considered the progression of symptoms Dr. Haydock described. "The letter's handwriting deteriorates quite markedly toward the end. Would such a substance cause trembling and confusion?" "Precisely those symptoms," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "Someone approaching from behind while she was writing could easily administer such an injection. The victim would experience increasing weakness and disorientation, making resistance impossible." Mrs. Jameson stepped forward with quiet dignity, her voice steady despite obvious distress. "I should mention that yesterday evening, after you all left, young Mary came to me with something troubling. She'd gone down to the kitchen the night before the fete and saw Mr. Patrick in the study very late, searching through papers by candlelight. She heard something metallic drop, like a ring hitting the wooden floor." Patrick's face went ashen at this revelation. "That's preposterous. I was never in the study after hours." The girl must be mistaken, probably saw shadows and imagined the rest. Inspector Slack studied Patrick with new attention, noting the defensive edge that had crept into his voice. "We'll need to interview this Mary ourselves, of course, and I think it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Van Heerden about his exact relationship with the deceased." Miss Marple observed the interplay of guilt and fear across Patrick's features as the investigation shifted from natural death to potential murder. The missing bank authorization, the deliberately removed signet ring, the suspicious late-night activity. Now medical evidence of poisoning created a pattern that pointed inexorably toward calculated crime rather than tragic coincidence. The letter mentions threats and fear for her safety. She noted thoughtfully. Mrs. Harrington was clearly writing under duress, trying to ensure justice would be done despite opposition from someone she trusted. Her pale blue eyes fixed on Patrick with gentle but unmistakable significance. The question now is whether she succeeded in protecting the evidence that would expose the truth, or whether someone managed to suppress it permanently. As Inspector Slack prepared to transform his investigation from routine death inquiry to murder case, the sealed letter had accomplished exactly what Mrs. Harrington intended, providing testimony from beyond the grave that would ensure her voice could not be permanently silenced, even if crucial pieces of evidence remained tantalizingly out of reach. Inspector Slack wasted no time in summoning Mary to the manor house kitchen, her nerves evident as she twisted her apron and avoided everyone's gaze. Under Slack's steady questioning, Mary recounted her late-night errand to fetch a hot water bottle for her grandmother. As she passed the study, she saw a sliver of candlelight beneath the door and heard the rustle of papers. Pausing at the corner, she recognized Mr. Patrick's hurried voice, followed by the scrape of a drawer, a faint metallic clink, and a muffled curse. The candle was then snuffed out abruptly, and Mary had hurried back to bed, too frightened to do more. The next morning, while dusting, she found a stub of sealing wax near the blotter and a faint red smear on the desk's wood, further evidence that something had transpired during the night. Pressed for more detail, Mary described seeing Patrick earlier that evening carrying a small leather case, the kind gentlemen use for shaving, that clinked as if it held glass. Patrick attempted to dismiss her account, insisting he had only been helping to look for lost items and suggesting the old house was prone to losing things. Yet the tension in his voice and the increasing complexity of his explanations revealed a man under pressure, his composure now visibly cracking. As the investigation continued, Miss Marple quietly requested a moment alone in the study. Years of village housekeeping had taught her precisely where small objects might tumble and be overlooked. With calm precision, she knelt by the skirting board and, using a fine steel crochet hook, probed the narrow seam where floor met wall. A delicate tug brought forth the missing signet ring, its intaglio still flecked with red wax and a thread of ash. She placed it on the desk without fanfare, but the significance was not lost on the room. Inspector Slack's relief was palpable as he turned to Patrick. "You said your aunt never parted with this. You'll want to explain how it found its way under the floorboards." Patrick's reply was defensive and evasive, his color fading as the evidence against him mounted. At this moment, Mr. Endicott returned with confirmation from the local branch of Lloyd's. There was indeed a deposit box opened by Mrs. Harrington under the name Mrs. S. Dale, requiring both a bank authorization chit and the named holder's identification to access. Without the chit, the box would not be released except after lengthy inquiry. The importance of the missing document, and who might benefit from its absence, became immediately clear. Miss Marple's thoughtful gaze fell on Mrs. Jameson, who had remained composed but watchful. With gentle respect, Miss Marple inquired if Dale meant anything to her. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Jameson admitted that Dale was her maiden name. She explained in a voice both proud and sorrowful that she had worked for the Harringtons in Johannesburg and lost her own brother to the mining scandal that ruined so many. Mrs. Harrington had brought her to England out of a sense of debt and a wish to make amends. Arranging the deposit box as restitution for losses, Mrs. Jameson never asked to be repaid. As the emotional weight of this confession settled over the room, the arrival of young Timothy Fletcher with the second post broke the tension. He bore a registered letter, edged in blue, addressed to Mrs. S. Dale, care of the manor. Inspector Slack signed for it, then opened it before the assembled company. Inside was a single sheet of thin-air mail paper and, carefully affixed a railway cloakroom ticket. The note, from a Johannesburg solicitor, explained that for security, duplicate authorizations had been sent by separate channels, and the enclosed ticket would allow Mrs. S. Dale to retrieve a parcel, presumably containing the bank chit and other documents, waiting at Much Benham Station. Patrick's reaction to the ticket was immediate and barely concealed. A flash of hunger in his eyes, quickly masked by an attempt at composure. Mrs. Jameson's hand flew to her throat, overwhelmed by the tangible proof that her late employer's final act of restitution might yet succeed. Miss Marple, observing both predation and fear, understood that the arrival of the ticket changed everything. Evidence that was meant to be suppressed had instead arrived by a circuitous route, raising the stakes for all involved. Inspector Slack, recognizing the urgency, announced his intention to accompany Mrs. Jameson to the station and retrieve the parcel. Miss Marple, her eyes as mild as ever, offered a mild observation. "In my experience, Inspector, the person who most desires a parcel rarely has the best claim to it." The room, charged with new tension, understood that justice was now within reach, but that danger, too, had never been closer. With the signet ring recovered, the identity of Mrs. Dale revealed, and the cloakroom ticket in hand, the investigation had entered its most perilous phase. Miss Marple's quiet competence and insight had brought the truth into the open, but the final confrontation between justice and desperation was yet to come. The journey to Much Benham Station proceeded with the measured tension of a legal proceeding whose outcome would determine not merely the distribution of wealth, but the very question of justice itself. Inspector Slack drove with careful attention to the winding country roads, while Mrs. Jameson sat rigidly upright beside him, the railway cloakroom ticket folded carefully in her gloved hands. Miss Marple occupied the rear seat, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm as she observed the autumn countryside, though her pale blue eyes occasionally shifted to the road behind them, where Patrick Harrington followed at a discreet distance in his own motor car. At the station, the parcels clerk examined the ticket with the deliberate care of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. The item in question proved to be not a simple parcel, but a steel document strong-box bearing the distinctive brass corners and lock mechanism of a solicitor's dispatch case. Official seals and registration marks confirmed its journey from Johannesburg, and the weight suggested substantial contents. Mrs. Jameson signed the receipt book with a trembling hand, her maiden name feeling strange after so many years of married life. Patrick had positioned himself near the station bookstall, affecting an air of casual interest in the railway timetables while maintaining clear sight lines to the parcels office. Miss Marple noted his white knuckles where he gripped a newspaper he was plainly not reading, and the way his breathing had become shallow with barely controlled anticipation. When Mrs. Jameson emerged with the strong-box, Patrick moved with calculated purpose toward the small group, his expression a carefully maintained mask of family concern. "Perhaps I should examine the contents first," he suggested, his voice carrying the authority of assumed inheritance. "There may be private family matters that would distress Mrs. Jameson unnecessarily." His eyes remained fixed on the strong-box with unmistakable hunger, and Miss Marple observed how his fingers twitched slightly as if preparing to grasp something that was rightfully his. Miss Marple stepped forward with gentle but unmistakable firmness, positioning herself between Patrick and Mrs. Jameson with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Harrington," she said mildly, "though I believe Inspector Slack will want to ensure proper legal procedures are followed. After all, the strongbox is addressed specifically to Mrs. Dale, and such official matters require careful witness." Inspector Slack, who had learned to appreciate Miss Marple's interventions, nodded decisively. "We'll examine the contents at Mr. Endicott's office, where everything can be properly documented and witnessed." Patrick's frustration flickered across his features before he could suppress it, and he stepped back with visible reluctance. his carefully laid plans for immediate access to the documents now thwarted by legal protocol. At the solicitor's office, Mr. Endicott prepared his desk with the methodical care of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Jameson produced a small key that had been sewn into the lining of her coat pocket, explaining quietly that Mrs. Harrington had given it to her the morning of the fete, with instructions to use it only if something happened to prevent the planned meeting with the solicitor. The strong box opened to reveal compartments lined with green baize, each containing carefully organized documents that told the complete story of Mrs. Harrington's final months. The bank authorization chit bore Mrs. Harrington's signature and the official seals required for the transfer of substantial funds to a trust account established for the victims of the Johannesburg mining scandal. Accompanying financial documents detailed the systematic fraud that had enriched Robert Harrington and his nephew while destroying the savings of dozens of investors who had trusted the company's falsified reports and deliberate misrepresentations. Most damaging of all was a leather-bound diary in Mrs. Harrington's distinctive handwriting, its final entries chronicling her growing fear of Patrick's increasingly desperate attempts to prevent her restitution plans. The pages revealed a woman wrestling with guilt over her late husband's crimes, while facing mounting pressure from a nephew who viewed her conscience as a direct threat to his inheritance. The final entry, dated the very morning of her death, spoke of sealed letters, hidden evidence, and a chilling premonition that Patrick would stop at nothing to preserve what he considers his rightful inheritance. Patrick's composure cracked visibly as Mr. Endicott read selected passages aloud, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and barely controlled panic. "Those entries are the fantasies of a confused elderly woman," he protested, his voice rising with desperation. Aunt Cynthia had become increasingly paranoid in her final months, imagining threats where none existed. Mrs. Aunt Jameson looked up from a personal letter addressed to her in Mrs. Harrington's hand, tears streaming down her face as she read words of apology, gratitude, and determination to ensure that justice would finally be served despite the opposition of those who benefited from past crimes. The letter concluded with specific instructions for accessing additional evidence and a warning that Patrick had already demonstrated his willingness to use any means necessary to protect his financial interests. Inspector Slack examined photocopied correspondence that revealed Patrick's intimate involvement in the original fraud, including letters urging his uncle to maintain false assay reports and delay investigations until maximum profit could be extracted from remaining investors. The documents painted a picture of calculated greed that had destroyed lives across 2 continents and continued to drive Patrick's current desperate actions. Miss Marple observed Patrick's increasingly frantic denials with the calm attention of someone who had seen such psychological disintegration before. His careful facade was crumbling under the weight of evidence that his aunt had methodically assembled, and she could see in his eyes the growing realization that his plans for suppressing the truth had failed completely. The sealed letter with its tear-stained wax had been only the beginning of Mrs. Harrington's posthumous testimony, and the strong box contained enough evidence to ensure that both the original fraud and her subsequent murder would be fully exposed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Mr. Endicott's office, the complete picture of Mrs. Harrington's final act of conscience became clear. She had not merely planned restitution for her husband's victims, but had also anticipated and prepared for the violent opposition such justice would provoke from those who had profited from the original crimes. The evidence was now secure, the legal mechanisms in place, and Patrick's desperate attempts at suppression had only served to confirm his guilt more completely than any confession could have accomplished. The strong box had delivered exactly what Mrs. Harrington intended, irrefutable proof that would ensure justice for both the living and the dead, regardless of the price she had paid for her final act of courage. The revelation of the strong box contents had transformed the atmosphere in Mr. Endicott's office from one of legal formality to something approaching a criminal tribunal. Patrick Harrington stood beside the solicitor's desk with the rigid posture of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, while Inspector Slack methodically photographed each document with the thoroughness of someone who understood that these papers represented not merely evidence, but justice long delayed. Miss Marple observed Patrick's reactions with the quiet attention she had learned to apply to such moments of crisis. His denials had grown increasingly desperate, but more telling were the small, unconscious gestures that revealed his intimate knowledge of matters he claimed to know nothing about. When Mr. Endicott mentioned specific bank account numbers from the Johannesburg documents, Patrick's eyes flickered with recognition before he could suppress it. When Mrs. Jameson described the foreign visitor's accent, Patrick corrected a small detail about South African pronunciation, then immediately attempted to cover his slip with protestations of general knowledge. Dr. Haydick's arrival with additional medical evidence provided the crucial link between the documentary proof of motive and the physical reality of murder. "I've been checking my medical supplies more carefully," he announced without preamble, "and I can confirm that a hypodermic syringe of the finest gauge is missing from my bag, the type used for precise dosing of cardiac medications." His grave expression indicated the significance of this discovery. "Moreover, I've identified the specific preparation that would have been required. Concentrated digitalis extract, the sort that would cause exactly the symptoms Mrs. Harrington exhibited." Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed interest. "When did you first notice the syringe was missing, Doctor?" "I can't be certain, but I suspect it disappeared during my call to the Blue Boar earlier this week. A traveling gentleman had developed a troublesome infection, and I left my bag unattended briefly while washing my hands." Dr. Haydick's clinical precision made the implications clear. The missing instrument would have been ideal for administering a precise, nearly undetectable injection. Patrick's composure showed another crack at this revelation, his hand moving unconsciously to his jacket pocket before he caught himself. Miss Marple noted this gesture with particular interest, remembering how often guilty parties betrayed themselves through such involuntary movements. "How very unfortunate that such a dangerous item should go missing at precisely this time," she observed mildly. "These coincidences are becoming rather difficult to dismiss," Inspector Slack said, his attention now focused entirely on Patrick. "Your presence at the manor that morning, your intimate knowledge of the financial arrangements you claim to know nothing about, and now a missing medical instrument from a location you frequented." Patrick rallied with a final attempt at misdirection, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone grasping at increasingly unlikely explanations. "You're all overlooking the obvious suspect," he declared, pointing toward the window in the direction of the Blue Boar. "This Van Heerden has medical knowledge, a clear motive for revenge, and he was the last person to see my aunt alive. He could easily have taken the syringe during his own treatment." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered this accusation. Van Heerden did indeed possess the necessary skills, and his bitter history with the Harrington family provided ample motive. The timing of his visit, so close to Mrs. Harrington's death, created a pattern that could support Patrick's desperate theory. Yet something in the nephew's manner suggested he was offering this alternative explanation with rather too much enthusiasm, as if he had been preparing such a deflection for precisely this moment. "An interesting possibility," she murmured thoughtfully. "Though I confess myself puzzled by certain small details that don't quite align with such a theory." Her pale blue eyes fixed on Patrick with gentle but unmistakable significance. For instance, the matter of the sealed letter and the missing signet ring. Such intimate knowledge of Mrs. Harrington's personal habits would suggest someone very close to her indeed. Inspector Slack gathered the documents with renewed purpose, recognizing that the investigation had reached the point where all remaining questions must be resolved through direct confrontation. "I think it's time we brought all parties together for a final accounting," he announced. "Tomorrow morning, at the manor, we'll have a complete reconstruction of events. Everyone who was present during Mrs. Marple's Harrington's final days will have the opportunity to clarify their role in this tragedy. Miss Marple nodded approvingly at this suggestion, knowing that in her considerable experience, the truth had a way of emerging when all the participants were gathered in the place where the crime had occurred. The sealed letter with its tear-stained wax had begun the process of revelation, but the final act of justice would require the careful orchestration of facts, motives, and human nature that only such a gathering could provide. As the autumn evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the stage was set for the final confrontation between truth and deception, with Miss Marple prepared to ensure that Mrs. Harrington's posthumous testimony would achieve the justice she had died trying to secure. The morning brought an autumn crispness to St. Mary Mead that seemed to sharpen both vision and resolve. Miss Marple arrived at the manor house to find Inspector Slack arranging the study with methodical precision, each piece of evidence positioned exactly where it belonged in the final act of this village tragedy. The writing desk had been restored to its condition on the fatal morning, complete with fresh blotting paper, sealing wax, and the recovered signet ring that had started this chain of revelations. The assembled company reflected all the human elements that had converged in this room 3 days earlier. Patrick Harrington stood near the fireplace with the rigid composure of a man whose carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Mr. Van Heerden maintained his dignified bearing, though his weathered hands showed the tension of someone who had traveled far to see justice finally served. Mrs. Jameson sat beside the window, her usual competence shadowed by grief but strengthened by determination to see her employer's final wishes fulfilled. Dr. Haydock occupied the chair nearest the desk, his medical bag a silent reminder of the clinical evidence that had transformed suspicion into certainty. Miss Marple settled into her customary position with her knitting, the gentle rhythm of her needles providing a deceptive counterpoint to the gravity of the moment. "Inspector," she said mildly, "perhaps we might begin with the sealed letter itself, since that remarkable document has been our guide throughout this investigation." Inspector Slack lifted the cream-colored envelope with its distinctive tear-stained wax seal, holding it so that the morning light revealed every detail of its construction. Mrs. Harrington wrote this letter while dying, knowing that someone she trusted was systematically destroying her attempts to make restitution for her husband's crimes. The question that troubled us from the beginning was why such a decisive woman would seal correspondence without addressing it. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving between the letter and the assembled witnesses. As I've maintained throughout this ordeal, Aunt Cynthia had become increasingly confused in her final months. The strain of relocating, combined with her advancing age, had clearly affected her judgment. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered this familiar refrain. Yet the handwriting in this letter remains quite steady for several paragraphs, Mr. Harrington. The deterioration occurs only toward the end, precisely when Dr. Haydock tells us the digitalis injection would have begun affecting her motor control. Dr. Haydock nodded with clinical precision. The symptoms would progress rapidly once the concentrated extract entered her system. Within minutes, she would have experienced trembling, weakness, and increasing disorientation. The injection site on her left hand indicates she was approached from behind while seated at this very desk. Mr. Van Heerden spoke with quiet dignity, his accent lending gravity to his words. Mrs. Harrington was entirely lucid during our conversation Thursday evening. She spoke specifically of evidence she had prepared to ensure justice would survive any attempts at suppression by family members who opposed her plans. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully between Patrick and the sealed letter. The genius of Mrs. Harrington's final act was not in what she wrote, but in how she preserved it. She knew she was in mortal danger, and she created a document that would survive even her own death. Inspector Slack moved to the desk, pointing to the recovered signet ring with its traces of red wax and ash. After injecting the fatal dose, the killer searched frantically for this letter, knowing it contained evidence of the restitution plans. But Mrs. Harrington had hidden it in the secret compartment, and in his haste to remove her signet ring and prevent proper authentication, the killer dropped it where Miss Marple later found it. Patrick's composure showed increasing strain as the logical progression of evidence closed around him like a net. These elaborate theories ignore the obvious explanation. Van Heerden had both motive and medical knowledge. His presence that evening, combined with his bitter history with our family, makes him the natural suspect. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the gentle expression that had deceived so many criminals into underestimating her perception. An interesting suggestion, though it raises several troubling questions. How would Mr. Van Heerden have known about the secret compartment or the specific arrangements Mrs. Harrington had made with the bank? Such intimate knowledge suggests someone who had been observing her habits for months, someone she trusted completely. Dr. Haydock stepped forward with the missing hypodermic syringe, now recovered from Patrick's motor car. Moreover, this instrument bears microscopic traces of the digitalis compound, and the fingerprint evidence confirms who handled it last. Mrs. Jameson spoke with quiet conviction, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony. Mr. Patrick had been pressuring Mrs. Harrington for weeks about her financial plans. I found him searching her papers on multiple occasions, always with explanations about helping to organize her affairs. He knew about the South African correspondence because he had been intercepting her mail. The net of evidence tightened with each revelation, but Miss Marple recognized that the final thread remained to be drawn. "The sealed letter tells us everything we need to know about that fatal morning," she said thoughtfully. Mrs. Harrington received the letter from Johannesburg and immediately understood that her time was running out. She wrote her final testimony quickly but carefully, knowing that someone in this house would try to prevent its discovery. Patrick's face had grown ashen, but he maintained his desperate denials. "You're all conspirators, building fantasies on coincidence and spite." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The tears that stained this wax seal were not tears of fear, Mr. Harrington, but tears of profound sorrow for a nephew she had loved and trusted, someone whose greed had driven him to betray everything she held dear. She sealed this letter knowing it would be her final act of love for you, ensuring that the truth would survive even if she did not." As Inspector Slack moved to place Patrick under formal arrest, the autumn sunlight streaming through the study windows illuminated the desk where Mrs. Harrington had fought her final battle for justice. Her sealed letter had accomplished exactly what she intended, ensuring that truth would survive the attempts of those who sought to bury it alongside their victim. The restitution she had planned would now proceed as intended, bringing some measure of justice to the victims of her husband's crimes and honoring the memory of a woman who had chosen conscience over comfort, even unto death. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction, reflecting that in her considerable experience, the human heart's capacity for both evil and redemption never ceased to amaze her. Mrs. Harrington's final letter, with its tear-stained seal and unaddressed envelope, had proven more powerful than any legal document, speaking from beyond the grave to ensure that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. The arrest of Patrick Harrington marked not an end, but a transformation of the tragedy that had shaken St. Mary Mead to its very foundations. As Inspector Slack formally charged him with the murder of his aunt, Patrick's carefully constructed facade crumbled entirely, revealing the desperate greed that had driven him to such extremes. His protests grew increasingly frantic before dissolving into sullen silence, the weight of irrefutable evidence finally crushing his last hopes of escape. Miss Marple observed this collapse with the gentle sadness of someone who had seen too often how human weakness could corrupt even the bonds of family affection. As the constable led Patrick away, she turned to address the remaining assembled company with her characteristic mixture of compassion and inexorable logic. "The tragedy of this case," she began, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm, "lay not merely in the crime itself, but in how completely Mrs. Harrington understood the danger she faced. She knew her nephew's character better than he knew it himself, and she prepared accordingly. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully around the study where so much had been revealed. When that final letter arrived from Johannesburg, containing the legal documentation that would complete her restitution plans, Mrs. Harrington realized that Patrick would act immediately to prevent the transfer of what he considered his inheritance. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. The digitalis injection was administered while she sat at this very desk, writing what she knew might be her final testimony. The concentrated extract, derived from foxglove in the manor's own garden, would have caused rapid cardiac irregularity and muscular weakness, preventing any cry for help or effective resistance. But Mrs. Harrington's genius, Miss Marple continued, lay in her understanding that even murder could not silence truth if properly preserved. The sealed letter was never intended merely as correspondence, but as evidence that would survive her death and guide investigators to the complete documentation she had so carefully hidden. The tears that stained the wax seal were genuine tears of sorrow for a nephew whose greed had transformed him into something she could no longer recognize or protect. Inspector Slack, grudgingly impressed by the complexity of the case, added his own observations. Patrick's confession revealed the methodical nature of his crime. He had been monitoring his aunt's correspondence for weeks, intercepting letters and pressuring her to abandon her restitution plans. When the final authorization arrived, he knew he had to act immediately or lose everything he believed was rightfully his. The weeks that followed brought the unglamorous but necessary business of justice taking its proper course. Patrick's trial proceeded with the inexorable precision of legal machinery, his guilt established beyond any reasonable doubt by the combination of physical evidence, documentary proof, and his own eventual confession. The concentrated digitalis, the stolen hypodermic syringe, the missing signet ring, and the detailed diary entries formed a chain of evidence that no clever legal maneuvering could break. Mrs. Jameson assumed her role as administrator of the restitution fund with the quiet dignity that had marked her entire career in service. Working closely with Mr. Endicott and Mr. Van Heerden, she ensured that the victims of the Johannesburg mining scandal finally received the compensation that justice had so long delayed. Her transformation from housekeeper to trustee represented a fitting tribute to Mrs. Harrington's final act of conscience, elevating someone who had suffered from the original fraud to a position where she could help heal its wounds. Mr. Van Heerden departed St. Mary Mead with his faith in justice partially restored, carrying with him the knowledge that Mrs. Harrington's sacrifice had not been in vain. His bitter journey across oceans had ended not with the revenge he had once sought, but with something far more valuable, the restoration of hope that right could still triumph over wrong, even when the victory came at such a terrible cost. The village itself recovered with the peculiar resilience that small communities display when confronting extraordinary events. The Harvest Festival fete would be remembered not for its interrupted prizes, but for the drama that had unfolded in its aftermath, though already the details were acquiring the polish of oft-told tales. Young Timothy Fletcher found himself elevated to something approaching heroic status, his role as a witness to crucial events growing more dramatic with each retelling. Mary, the housemaid whose courage had provided vital testimony, secured employment with Colonel Melchett, her reputation for sharp observation making her quite sought after among households that valued discretion and attention to detail. Dr. Haydock visited Miss Marple one crisp autumn afternoon, settling into her garden with the satisfied air of a man whose professional conscience had been vindicated. "The final toxicology reports confirmed everything we suspected," he said, accepting her offer of tea with obvious pleasure. Patrick's knowledge of chemistry, gained during his mining ventures, had enabled him to create a preparation that would cause fatal cardiac failure while leaving minimal traces. Without your guidance in recognizing the significance of that sealed letter, he might well have succeeded in his deception. Miss Marple poured tea with her characteristic attention to proper ceremony, reflecting on the chain of small observations that had revealed the larger truth. Mrs. Harrington understood human nature remarkably well for someone who had lived such a sheltered life. She knew that Patrick would search frantically for evidence of her restitution plans, but she also knew that greed would make him careless in crucial moments. The missing signet ring became his greatest mistake, for if he had simply left it in place, the sealed letter might have been dismissed as the confused ramblings of a dying woman. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the autumn leaves dance in the gentle breeze while her mind dwelt on the human tragedy that had played out in their peaceful village. Mrs. Harrington had faced an impossible choice between family loyalty and moral obligation, ultimately choosing justice at the cost of her own life. Her nephew had chosen greed over love, destroying not only his aunt, but also his own future in pursuit of wealth that was never rightfully his. The sealed letter with its tear-stained wax had become something of a legend in the village, though few understood its true significance as a masterpiece of posthumous detection. Mrs. Harrington had written her own mystery story, complete with clues, red herrings, and a final revelation that had exposed the truth with devastating precision. She had played a game of chess with a murderer and managed to achieve checkmate from beyond the grave. In her final diary entry, discovered among Mr. Endicott's papers, Mrs. Harrington had written with prophetic clarity, "If I must choose, let it be truth that survives me." It was, Miss Marple reflected, the perfect epitaph for a woman who had demonstrated that even in the face of mortal danger, the human spirit could rise to extraordinary heights of nobility and sacrifice. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go indoors, satisfied that justice had been served and the village's peace restored. In her considerable experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, hiding their malice behind masks of family affection and social propriety. Mrs. Harrington's final letter had stripped away such pretenses with surgical precision, revealing the corruption that had festered beneath the surface of apparent respectability. The autumn wind stirred the last leaves on the elm trees, carrying with it the promise of winter's cleansing cold and the eventual return of spring's renewal. St. Mary Mead would endure, as it always had, its fundamental decency, strengthened rather than diminished by the confrontation with evil. The sealed letter had accomplished its purpose, ensuring that truth would triumph over deception and that the innocent would finally receive the justice that had been so long denied. Walking through her quiet cottage, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Harrington's greatest achievement had not been her wealth or social position, but her final act of moral courage. The letter sealed with tears had become a testament not merely to one woman's determination, but to the enduring power of truth to survive even the most determined attempts at suppression. In choosing conscience over comfort, justice over family loyalty, she had demonstrated that the human heart, however broken by betrayal, could still choose righteousness even unto death. As Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair with her knitting, the gentle rhythm of her needles seemed to echo the quiet satisfaction of another mystery solved and another victory for justice achieved. The village slept peacefully around her, secure in the knowledge that truth, like a persistent stream, would always find its way to the light.